I'm not sure where to start, so I'll begin with the basics. My name is Alex. I'm 22 years old. From 1999 to 2003, I went to a small private elementary school in Georgia called Warwood Elementary. It wasn't a religious school and had about 300 kids. I was an only child and my parents were divorced. After they split up, I never saw my dad again. My mom had a new boyfriend, but they never got married, just stayed engaged. I don't remember my first year at Warwood very clearly because I was in kindergarten. I made a friend named Tony, and we stayed friends until I moved in 2004. I won't bore you with too many details about my life, but I want to share some strange things. In the year 2000, Tony and I were in Mrs. Anderson's class. She was in her 30s, had short hair, and looked a bit like Jamie Lee Curtis. She was very kind and loved by both students and parents. At Warwood, different grades had different recess times. Pre-K through second grade had recess from 11:30 to 12, and third through fifth grade had it from 12 to 12:30. Our playground was huge, even though our classes were small. It had a slide, a bridge, ladders, monkey bars, and a big plastic rock dome with dinosaur bones on the ceiling. We called it the Dino Dome. Tony and I would meet up there with our friends Scotty and Phil from second grade. Scotty's brother was in fourth grade, and Phil's sister was in fifth. They had both been at Warwood since pre-K. During my first grade, I heard a rumor about a bad chair. Scotty was sure that his brother Mark had been sent to it. I first heard about the bad chair at lunch, right after recess. A boy named Eddie told me about it in a quiet voice. "Alex, do you know about the bad chair?" I shook my head because I was shy and usually just nodded instead of talking. Eddie told me it was in the teacher's break room, which was a small room with a fridge and a bathroom. I nodded again. Eddie said he'd seen inside the teacher's lounge. He said there was another door inside that room. I didn't believe it at first. No kid, living or dead, should be able to get into the teacher's place. Eddie explained that on his way back to Mrs. Tudor's class, he saw a teacher go into the room. When the door opened, he said he saw a table, chairs, and another door. So, that's where the bad chair is. I still didn't know what the bad chair was. Then Eddie told me about J-Boy, a fourth grader who had been expelled that week for bad behavior. Remember how J-Boy messed up Mrs. Ludke's desk and used his Boy Scout stuff to burn all the tests? Well, he got something worse than detention. Eddie said J-Boy didn't even live at home anymore. He lived at the hospital now, and it was because of the bad chair. After lunch, I was very curious about the bad chair. I think it was a Friday. The weekend passed, and when I met my friends at the Dino Dome, I asked if they had heard about the bad chair. Tony said he thought it was just a big lie. Eddie had mentioned it but didn't tell us everything before he had to leave. Then Steve, a fifth grader who was often sick and missed recess, peeked into the Dino Dome. It was unusual for a fifth grader to talk to first graders like us. We were all surprised to see him. Steve asked if we were talking about the bad chair. We all froze, afraid to make any noise, so the teachers wouldn't hear. Steve came inside and told us that the bad chair was in the teacher's lounge, which the fifth graders called the lounge, though it seemed too fancy for us. He said the bad chair was used for bad things. We were all shocked. No one usually talked to fifth graders like that, but Steve didn't seem to mind. Steve looked outside the Dino Dome again to make sure no teachers were around. "You guys know about J-Boy, right?" he asked. We all said yes at the same time. Steve said J-Boy was a hero because he was the first one to escape the bad chair. Steve explained that after J-Boy did all the bad stuff, he was sent to the principal's office. Lucky, the principal, took him to the teacher's lounge, and then someone from there took him down a set of stairs to the room with the bad chair. Tony, still skeptical, asked Steve if he knew all this for sure. Steve said J-Boy told his friend Finn from my class about it before he went crazy. J-Boy said the room was very dark, except for some candles on the floor. In the middle of the room was the bad chair, which was wooden and had leather straps. On the top of the chair, where your head goes, there was a human skull. Phil shuddered when he heard this. Steve's face was serious. When Tony asked what happened next, Steve said they started doing something he called wood dancing. I laughed, thinking it was a setup for a joke, but Steve shook his head. "It's not a joke. It's weird dancing," he said. The people in the room twisted and bent in strange ways, wearing black clothes and whispering. J-Boy screamed, but no one could hear him because he was too far down. Tony asked how J-Boy got out. Steve looked scared and said something went wrong. "Something joined them," he said. Just then, Mrs. Chandra, the recess attendant, walked into the Dino Dome. We all screamed, making Mrs. Chandra jump and then laugh. Steve turned very pale and looked like he was about to cry. Mrs. Chandra asked if we were telling scary stories. We said yes, and she told us to keep it light. Steve answered almost robotically, and Mrs. Chandra left after telling us there were only 5 more minutes of recess. After Mrs. Chandra left, Steve ran out of the Dino Dome looking upset. We didn't see him again for a while. In the days that followed, Steve seemed quiet and normal, but then he was absent from school. Most students thought Steve's absence was due to his frequent hospital visits, and we didn't suspect anything else. However, Tony had some good questions about J-Boy's situation. Why weren't his parents doing anything about the bad chair rumors? If other kids had been sent to the bad chair, why didn't anyone remember it? It couldn't have just disappeared, as people would have noticed if many kids were missing or dead. As time went by, we learned more about the bad chair, usually from older kids. Apparently, if the bad chair worked, you wouldn't remember anything about it. That's why J-Boy's escape was so important. He remembered everything. Other kids had disappeared, but they didn't know it. We didn't know where the older kids got their information from. Months passed, and the talk about the bad chair and J-Boy faded. We were told by Principal Abner that Steve had spent his last months in the hospital fighting cancer, but had sadly passed away. Tony decided the bad chair was just a scary story made up by the 5th graders to scare us. We almost believed that until the last day of 1st grade. With summer approaching, everyone was excited, and we had a pizza party with Miss Lucky's 2nd grade class. We were playing games, singing songs, and telling stories. During the party, a 2nd grader named William came running into the room, looking upset. He had just left to use the restroom a few minutes before. Miss Anderson and Miss Lucky gave each other worried looks. Miss Anderson went to William and asked him what was wrong. William was crying hard and had even thrown up a little on the carpet. Miss Anderson tried to comfort him and asked him to explain. William finally cried out, "Steve! It's Steve!" He was so upset he couldn't explain more. Miss Anderson tried to take William into the hall, but he refused and curled up on the floor. An adult who had been called to the room offered to call his parents, but Miss Anderson asked them to wait and see if William calmed down. The room mom looked uneasy but agreed to wait. William finally said, "I saw Steve. I saw Steve." When Miss Anderson asked which Steve, William cried, "The dead Steve." The room went silent, and Miss Anderson, along with another adult, led us out of the classroom. We whispered among ourselves while waiting for our parents. As the day ended, none of us wanted to leave. We needed to understand what William had seen. We never found out until 2nd grade began. I spent the summer thinking about William, Steve, and the bad chair, asking Tony and our other friends if they had heard anything new, but no one knew. Tony and I met up to ask around about William, who was now in 3rd grade with Scotty and Phil. Eddie, the same boy who first told me about the bad chair, had the answers. He told us that William no longer went to school there. He was being homeschooled now. Eddie said that while William was using the bathroom, he heard weird squishy sounds and growling. When he opened the door, he saw Steve on the ground, but it wasn't really Steve anymore. It was something else that looked like Steve, but wasn't him. Nobody really knew what it was. Because of this, William started seeing a doctor, and was now homeschooled. Our new teacher, Miss Licking, told us that students would no longer go to the bathroom alone and would always need a buddy. This rule was obviously because of the Steve and J. Boy incidents. During recess at the start of the year, Mrs. Chandra would frequently check the Dino Dome, even when we weren't there. We stopped hanging out there and started walking around the playground instead, if we needed to talk. One day, Scotty mentioned that his older brother, now in 5th grade, had been sent to detention for cheating on a test. Scotty asked him what detention was like, and his brother said he didn't remember because he fell asleep. Scotty started crying, and when Miss Chandra asked what was wrong, Scotty didn't say anything about the bad chair. Miss Chandra offered to take him to the nurse, but Scotty refused and cried harder. After recess, we saw Miss Chandra go into the teacher's lounge. That day, I remember clearly, just 2 rooms down, the kindergarten class was having nap time while we were in a math lesson with Miss Lucky. Suddenly, all the lights went out. There was a lot of screaming and crying, and Miss Lucky left the room, leaving us with her assistant, Rachel. She told us to stay calm. After a few minutes, the lights came back on, and the crying stopped almost immediately. Miss Lucky told us the kindergartners were scared of the dark. However, the kindergartners told us during recess that the power outage and screaming had caused their fear. My friends and I decided to ask some kindergartners what had scared them so much. We found a few who told us similar stories. To make it clearer, I've changed their language to make it more understandable, but their stories are told just as they shared them. First, we asked a blonde girl whose name I don't remember. She said before nap time, Miss Natasha had prayed for them, which was strange because our school was non-religious. She wasn't praying to God, but to something else with a name we couldn't pronounce. She mentioned Steve, Dead Steve, and J. Boy. This made them feel weird and tingly, and they became sleepier than before. The girl said she didn't remember how long they were asleep, but when she woke up, something came into the room. Another kindergarten student said Miss Natasha's prayer made her feel sleepy really fast. She closed her eyes, but she saw Miss Natasha leave the room and something join them. She was scared and felt like she shouldn't have been awake, but she stayed quiet. We talked to one more kindergartner named Joshua. He had tennis ball friends with eyes drawn on them that he talked to. He said that during nap time, Miss Natasha's prayer made him feel warm and tingly, and then he fell asleep. It became clear that the bad chair and the things happening at our school were linked in ways we couldn't fully understand. The stories from the kindergartners only made us more anxious and curious. Tony interrupted. Joshua put one of his tennis balls right in my face. Yes, something did come. We all woke up with the lights off. Miss Natasha had left them on, so we didn't know where she was. We screamed, and we didn't know why. I was screaming and didn't even know why until it hurt. We all felt something touch us, one by one. We never talked about it, but Joshua said something that made it clear, and then he smiled. Recess ended, and no kindergartners told their parents what happened. No one asked, or if they did, they didn't say anything. Only me, Tony, Scotty, and Phil knew about what Joshua and the others had said. School went on like normal for years, and we thought things were back to normal. But 3 days ago, I learned something new. My mom told me about a story from my 2nd grade year that I don't remember. She said my friends and I drew nasty stuff on our teacher's whiteboard and were sent to detention. I don't remember that at all. I think it's because we didn't draw on the whiteboard or go to detention. Instead, we must have been sent somewhere else. We probably sat in the bad chair, and whatever happened there made me forget the rest of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades. I went back to Augusta, Georgia to find Warwood Elementary. Instead, I found a different school in its place. The building looked the same but was remodeled and painted differently. I asked the front desk about the school's history, explaining that I used to go there when it was called Warwood. "Oh yes, Warwood," they said. "It was renamed after the management changed." "Management change?" I asked. "Yes, most of the original staff left suddenly," they replied. Was any reconstruction done to the interior? I asked, looking down the hall where the teacher's lounge used to be. Not that I know of, they said. Why? I have some fuzzy memories of one room and would like to clear them up. I'm afraid I can't let you into any rooms without special permission. That's okay. I understand. Do any of the old teachers from Warwood still work here? Yes, one, Natasha Tuber. She still teaches kindergarten. Did she teach you? I asked. Not me personally, but I do remember her. Would you like to speak with her after school? The day ends in about an hour. Yes, I would appreciate that. I waited outside the office and browsed my phone. The woman at the front desk called Natasha and let her know I was coming. What's your name, sir? She asked. Alex. Alex, a former student. Natasha remembers you. She's excited to see you. I smiled, though my heart raced and I felt sick. I excused myself to the restroom, which looked just as I remembered. I recalled the story about dead Steve appearing in this very bathroom. As I washed my hands, a boy entered and said, "Hello?" "Hello," I replied. "Are you someone's daddy?" he asked. "Nope." The boy, standing outside the stalls and watching me, said, "You look like someone's daddy." I awkwardly waved goodbye and left the restroom. I saw the door to the lounge, now fancier and labeled Teacher's Lounge. I casually walked by and peeked inside. The door was unlocked, so I went in. Inside, it was the same as I remembered. A fridge, coffee table, sink, staff restroom, and chairs. There was also the same door I had seen before. I checked behind me to make sure no teachers were coming, and then focused on the door. I approached it with a trembling hand and turned the doorknob. It creaked open to reveal a dark staircase going down. Cold air hit me, and my head began to throb. I used my phone's light to guide me as I went down the stairs. At the bottom, I found a light switch and turned it on. The room was full of boxes and shelves. There was no bad chair, candles, or disturbing symbols. Despite this, my head and back ached. Natasha was standing at the bottom of the stairs, smiling and wearing a floral dress. "Welcome back, Alex," she said. I tried to leave, but Natasha moved past me gently, almost floating. She knelt by a large box and opened it. When I saw what was inside, I fell to my knees. It was something I barely remembered, neither human nor animal. I was paralyzed with pain so intense that I wished I could die. Natasha spoke, but her words were incomprehensible. She placed a skull on my head, and I saw visions of teachers in black, candles, bindings, distorted faces, and a shaking ground. I saw Tony, Phil, and Scotty, all writhing and vomiting. Natasha showed me scenes of the bad chair, the rituals, and the chanting. I remembered the time at school after sitting in the bad chair, the throne, the worship, the plans, the visions, and the rituals. Natasha said whatever happened to Steve and J-Boy always comes back. It leaves a piece of itself everywhere. Everyone will eventually sit in the bad chair and become part of it. There's nothing that can be done. It will always come back.